Leno wasn't just a late-night comic with a garage full of cars. To millions, he was the grinning king of NBC's The Tonight Show, the man who turned middle America humor into a ratings empire. But behind the jokes and denim shirts, a darker story has always lingered. Whispers of rivals, silent grudges, public battles that stretched on for decades. And today we're peeling back the curtain, 7 names, 7 feuds, and 7 clashes that define Jay's career. Some you've heard about. Others, you won't believe. Join us as we reveal the 7 rivals Jay Leno reportedly hated the most. Let's dive in. To understand Jay Leno's rivalries, you first have to understand Jay himself. Born James Douglas Muir. Leno in 1950, the son of an immigrant homemaker from Scotland and a hard-working insurance salesman, Jay grew up in Andover, Massachusetts. From an early age, classmates noticed 2 things: his sharp wit and his relentless drive. Teachers often complained that he was disruptive, constantly cracking jokes. But Jay turned that restlessness into a gift. By his 20s, he was on the stand-up circuit, grinding through small clubs in Boston and New York before making the big leap to Los Angeles. For Leno, comedy wasn't just a job, it was a mission. He wasn't the edgy, envelope-pushing type like Richard Pryor or George Carlin. Instead, Jay built his reputation on a clean, relatable style that could make your grandmother laugh just as much as your college roommate. By the late 1970s, his appearances on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson made him a familiar face. And behind the curtain, Jay was playing a long game. In 1987, NBC named Leno the permanent guest host for Carson. That role put him in the front row of late-night history. Every time Carson took a night off, Jay stepped in. He studied Carson's timing, his cool presence, and the way he balanced guests with monologues. But more than that, Jay started to see The Tonight Show not as an institution to protect, but as a prize to win. By the early 1990s, that hunger would define him. The late-night wars were in full swing. Johnny Carson retired in 1992, and suddenly the fight for succession turned ugly. NBC's choice of Jay over fan favorite David Letterman ignited one of the most notorious TV rivalries of all time. The fallout shaped Leno's reputation for decades. Through the 90s and 2000s, Jay became one of the most dominant late-night hosts ever. At his peak, he drew more than 5 million viewers a night, often beating Letterman, Conan O'Brien, and other competitors. But with success came resentment. Critics called him safe, predictable, even opportunistic. His fellow comics accused him of undercutting friends, of playing corporate politics too well. Off-screen, Jay leaned into his image as a down-to-earth guy. He told interviewers he never touched his Tonight Show salary, living only off his stand-up money. He collected cars instead of scandals. He didn't drink, didn't party, didn't go out of control like some of his peers. To fans, he was disciplined, hardworking, maybe even boring. But to rivals, that same discipline looked like calculation. That same nice guy mask looked like strategy. And here's where it gets messy. For every polished monologue, there was a whisper of betrayal. For every handshake, a rumor of bitterness. Over time, Jay Leno's career wasn't just about the jokes. It was about the wars he fought to stay on top. But here's the truth. Nobody climbs to the top of late night without making enemies. And Jay Leno? He made plenty. Some were fellow comics who felt he stole opportunities. Others were network executives who found themselves double-crossed. Still others were longtime colleagues who grew tired of his relentless drive to win. 7 rivalries, stretching from the early 1990s all the way into the 2010s, came to define him. Some were played out on national TV. Others were whispered about in green rooms and industry gossip columns. And whether you loved him or hated him, Jay's feuds painted a picture of a man who could smile for the cameras, while never forgetting who stood in his way. Are you ready? Because it's time to count down the 7 rivals Jay Leno reportedly hated the most. Jimmy Kimmel. For years, Jimmy Kimmel was the cheeky kid in late night, the comic who built his reputation on roast-style humor and brash sketches. But when it came to Jay Leno, Kimmel didn't just poke fun, he went for the jugular. Fans remember it vividly. The Jay Leno Show debacle in 2009 to 2010, when NBC's late-night lineup collapsed under corporate confusion. That's when Jimmy went from playful competitor to open rival, and Jay, by all accounts, never forgot it. The roots of their clash go back to 2009, when NBC shifted Jay out of The Tonight Show and handed the desk to Conan O'Brien. Jay was given a primetime experiment, The Jay Leno Show, airing at 10 p.m. 5 nights a week. But when ratings tanked, NBC tried to push Conan back to a later slot, reinstating Leno at 11:35. It was a mess, and in the middle of the chaos, Jimmy Kimmel spotted an opening. Kimmel, who had only launched Jimmy Kimmel Live in 2003, used the debacle to carve out his identity. Where other hosts stayed diplomatic, Jimmy went all in. He impersonated Jay on air, mocking his voice, his mannerisms, even his reputation for playing corporate politics. On January 12, 2010, during his entire show, Kimmel sat at a fake desk in a fake chin prosthetic, pretending to be Jay Leno for the full hour. It was brutal parody, and fans couldn't believe he pulled it off. On the surface, Leno brushed it off. His trademark grin never slipped when asked about Kimmel's routine. But according to industry chatter, Jay was livid. Behind the scenes, insiders claimed he saw it as personal betrayal, especially because up until then, Jimmy had treated him with respect. The real breaking point came days later, when Jay hosted a special 10 at 10 segment and invited Kimmel to appear via satellite. What was meant to be light banter turned into a televised ambush. Jimmy used every one of his allotted 10 questions to mock Leno directly. Ever prank called NBC executives to see if you still had a job? Have you ever hosted anything that didn't end in disaster? The audience howled, but Jay's frozen smile told another story. Fans who watched closely that night swear they could see the tension crack through the screen. Jay, known for controlling interviews, suddenly looked cornered. Clips of that exchange spread like wildfire. Entertainment outlets replayed it for weeks, branding it as one of the most awkward late-night segments ever. Online forums exploded. Some fans cheered Kimmel for saying what everyone else was thinking during NBC's meltdown. Others criticized him for being disrespectful to a veteran who had paved the way for younger hosts. Years later in interviews, Jimmy admitted he regretted how harshly he went after Jay, saying he might have gone too far. But by then, the damage was done. Fans had already labeled Kimmel as Leno's most fearless critic. For Jay, the clash with Kimmel was a reminder that late night wasn't just about competing with peers like Letterman or Conan. It was about fending off a new generation hungry to claim the spotlight. The feud may not have cost him his career, but it certainly bruised his reputation. Suddenly, the once unflappable host looked vulnerable, mocked openly by a younger rival who wasn't afraid to bite. Kimmel, meanwhile, cemented his brand as a sharp-tongued host, unafraid of punching up. Some argue that his very public takedown of Jay accelerated his credibility in late night, helping him carve his lane against bigger players. But if Jimmy Kimmel was the loud rival who mocked him in public, the next feud was quieter, longer, colder, and more painful. Because it wasn't just a competitor. It was a mentor who once saw Jay as a protege. Are you ready for the next? Johnny Carson. If Jay Leno's rivalry with Jimmy Kimmel was loud, public, and meme-worthy, his clash with Johnny Carson was the opposite, quiet, cold, and devastating. To millions of viewers, Carson was the undisputed king of late night. For 30 years, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was a cultural institution, and whoever would inherit that throne would step into the history books. Jay Leno got the chair, but Johnny Carson never forgave him for it. And for decades, the silence between the two men was louder than any insult. When Jay first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1977, Carson saw potential in him. Jay wasn't polished, but he was fast, clever, and unflappable, traits Johnny admired. Over the next decade, Jay became one of Carson's regular guest comedians, earning slots on big nights. In 1987, NBC named Leno the show's permanent guest host, which meant whenever Carson took a night off, Jay was the man behind the desk. At first, Carson seemed comfortable with this arrangement, but everything shifted in 1992. When Carson announced his retirement, many assumed David Letterman, who had followed Carson for a decade with Late Night with David Letterman, was the natural successor. He had a loyal fan base, critical acclaim, and a style that felt like the next logical chapter in Late Night. But NBC executives thought differently. They worried Letterman was too edgy, too unpredictable, and possibly less advertiser-friendly than Jay. Behind the scenes, Jay's manager, the formidable Helen Kushnick, lobbied fiercely for him. Some reports even claim she orchestrated leaks to the press that undermined Letterman's chances. Whether Jay personally knew or not, the optics made him look like the ruthless contender. When NBC finally announced Jay as Carson's successor, it sent shockwaves through television, and Johnny Carson was reportedly livid. On screen, Jay paid constant tribute to Carson. He thanked him in interviews, praised his influence, and carried himself as the grateful protege. But off-screen, Carson was said to feel betrayed. According to numerous industry insiders, Johnny had favored Letterman, seeing him as the rightful heir. In fact, Carson allegedly told friends he never wanted Leno to have the desk. The bitterness showed in subtle but powerful ways. When Carson taped his final show on May 22, 1992, his guest hosts and regular comedians were lined up in tribute, but Jay Leno was nowhere to be seen. Carson didn't invite him. Instead, Bette Midler and Robin Williams closed out the historic run. Then came the final cutting gesture. For the rest of his life, Johnny Carson never appeared on Leno's Tonight Show. Not once. He made rare cameo appearances on Letterman's Late Show instead, including a famous moment in 1994 when Letterman brought out a stool for Carson, who performed a quick silent monologue. The audience roared and the symbolism was undeniable. Carson had chosen his true heir, and it wasn't Jay. The feud between Carson and Leno was never a shouting match. It was a war of absence. Entertainment journalists picked up on the silence quickly. Columns in the 90s regularly pointed out that Carson, though retired, would occasionally fax jokes to Letterman to use in his monologues. Leno, who sat in Carson's chair every night, was excluded from that privilege. Fans noticed too. Letters to TV Guide and early internet forums debated the snub endlessly. Some viewers defended Jay, arguing he had simply played the corporate game better than Letterman. Others insisted Carson's cold shoulder validated every criticism of Leno, that he was ambitious to a fault, willing to push aside mentors to secure his place. When Carson died in 2005, Letterman honored him with a full monologue of Carson's unused jokes. Leno, who hosted The Tonight Show at the time, offered warm tributes, but critics couldn't help but note that Johnny's final public nod had gone elsewhere. For Jay Leno, Carson's rejection became both a wound and a motivator. On one hand, he never had the public blessing of the man whose chair he occupied. On the other, he turned that lack of approval into fuel, doubling down on his work ethic. Night after night, Jay delivered middle America comedy that drew massive audiences, even if critics rolled their eyes. But the feud also shaped how fans saw him. Unlike Letterman, who carried Carson's visible endorsement, Leno was often cast as the usurper, the guy who snuck in with backroom deals rather than the chosen heir. That perception haunted him throughout his career, resurfacing whenever controversies hit. Even decades later, when asked about Carson, Jay carefully sidestepped. He never badmouthed Johnny, always praising his brilliance. But fans knew the silence spoke volumes. Johnny never forgave, and Jay never forgot. So if Johnny Carson was the mentor who froze Jay out, the next rival was the opposite, a peer who went head-to-head with him every single night, trading ratings blows like heavyweight boxers. And their feud, it defined an entire era of television. Are you ready for number 3? David Letterman. If Johnny Carson's rejection haunted Jay Leno, David Letterman became the living, breathing rival he couldn't escape. Their feud wasn't just personal, it was televised, dissected, and replayed for decades. To many, the so-called late-night wars weren't about comedy at all. They were about two men, two styles, and one coveted seat behind the Tonight Show desk. And if Jay was the safe, smiling everyman, Dave was the edgy outsider, sarcastic, sharp, and always ready with a barb. Together, they defined a rivalry that turned late-night TV into a cultural battlefield. David Letterman joined NBC in 1982 with Late Night, airing directly after Carson. His absurdist humor, top 10 lists, and willingness to push the format made him a critic's darling. For a decade, many assumed he was Johnny Carson's heir. After all, he'd been nurtured at NBC, he had the time slot, and he had Carson's personal respect. But in 1992, when Carson retired, the torch didn't go to Letterman. It went to Jay Leno. NBC executives cited Jay's broader appeal and advertiser friendliness. But insiders pointed to Leno's aggressive backstage campaigning. His manager, Helen Kushnick, was reportedly relentless in securing the job, even at the cost of alienating network brass. Whether or not Jay orchestrated the strategy, the decision cut Letterman deeply. The fallout was immediate. Dave bolted to CBS, launching The Late Show with David Letterman in 1993. What followed was a nightly duel between Jay at NBC and Dave at CBS, with millions of viewers choosing sides. It wasn't just television, it was war. On screen, the rivalry was veiled in jokes. Dave mocked Jay's famous chin, his headlines segments, even his denim wardrobe. Jay, for his part, avoided direct shots, preferring to stay affable. But off-screen, the bitterness was real. Friends of Letterman claimed he felt betrayed, believing that Carson had wanted him to succeed. Jay, meanwhile, insisted it was simply business, that NBC made the call, and he did the job offered. The tension leaked into interviews. Letterman quipped on 60 Minutes in 1994 that Leno was probably the most insecure person I know. Jay responded in a more diplomatic tone, but the damage was done. Their relationship never recovered. Even within Hollywood, the divide was stark. Celebrities chose sides, some preferring Leno's broad platform, others aligning with Letterman's critical edge. Industry writers chronicled the feud like a sports rivalry, measuring ratings like scores. For years, the two traded leadership. Jay often dominated with Middle America viewers, while Dave claimed cultural cachet and awards. The evidence of their feud is everywhere. In 1994, a Rolling Stone cover story dubbed it The Battle for Late Night, painting Jay as the corporate suit and Dave as the rebellious artist. Fans debated fiercely, letters poured into magazines, and early online chat rooms lit up with Team Leno versus Team Letterman. In 2009, when Conan O'Brien briefly took over The Tonight Show, Letterman reignited the rivalry. He skewered NBC's handling of the situation, poking fun at Jay's return. One of his sharpest monologues mocked NBC's indecision. "You've got Conan at 11:35, Jay at midnight. It's the only network with two shows hosted by the same guy." Audiences roared, but Jay once again maintained his public grin. Fans split on interpretation. Some admired Jay's ability to shrug it off, seeing him as the steady hand. Others believed Dave's barbs revealed the truth, that Jay was opportunistic, more loyal to himself than to tradition. The rivalry with Letterman defined Jay's legacy. For nearly 2 decades, the two men were measured against each other. When Jay consistently won the ratings war, critics sneered that he had pandered to safer jokes. When Letterman landed cultural moments, like his post-9/11 monologue, critics argued he proved himself Carson's true heir. For Jay, beating Dave in ratings was validation. He proved he didn't need Carson's blessing to succeed. But the victory was bittersweet, because the shadow of betrayal lingered. No matter how many viewers tuned in, there was always the narrative that he'd stolen the job from the man many believed deserved it. For Letterman, the rivalry became both curse and fuel. He never let go of the bitterness, but he used it to drive his show's edge. Some fans argue that without Jay, Dave's comedy wouldn't have stayed as sharp. The rivalry kept both men in motion. By the time Letterman retired in 2015, the feud had mellowed into history. Jay praised Dave as the best broadcaster of our generation. Letterman, in return, offered backhanded compliments. The cold respect remained, but the warmth never returned. If David Letterman was the public rival who battled Jay night after night, the next feud was more complicated. Because it wasn't just about ratings or comedy, it was about promises broken, dreams shattered, and one of the ugliest transitions in TV history. You know what's coming. Number 4 is Conan O'Brien. Conan O'Brien. If Jay Leno's feud with David Letterman was about a job never given, his rivalry with Conan O'Brien was about a job taken back. To many fans, this was the feud that cemented Jay's reputation as television's ultimate survivor and, in the eyes of critics, the ultimate opportunist. The Tonight Show saga of 2009 to 2010 remains one of the messiest chapters in TV history. And right at the center, Jay and Conan, two comics who couldn't have been more different, locked in a battle neither asked for, but neither could escape. The seeds were planted years earlier. In 1993, when David Letterman bolted to CBS, NBC tapped Conan O'Brien, then a relatively unknown comedy writer from Saturday Night Live, and The Simpsons to take over late night. The gamble was risky. Conan struggled in his early years, but eventually found his groove with surreal, absurdist humor that spoke to younger audiences. Meanwhile, Jay Leno reigned at The Tonight Show. By the mid-2000s, NBC worried about Conan leaving for another network. To secure his future, they made a deal. Conan would inherit The Tonight Show in 2009. Leno, then 59, would step aside. Publicly, Jay agreed, telling fans he was happy to pass the torch. Privately, some say he never truly let go. In 2009, the transition happened. Conan O'Brien officially became host of The Tonight Show. But almost immediately, ratings dipped. Conan's younger, edgier style didn't connect with the broader late-night audience NBC had counted on. Affiliates complained. And Jay, who had been given his own 10 p.m. Jay Leno show, wasn't faring much better. By January 2010, NBC executives panicked. Their solution? Move Jay back to 11:35, bump Conan's Tonight Show to 12:05. For Conan, it was an insult. For Jay, it was an opening. On screen, the chaos spilled into monologues. Conan cracked jokes about being demoted, using gallows humor to mask his frustration. He delivered a famous line, "For 60 years, The Tonight Show has aired after the local news. I honestly believe delaying it by a half hour will destroy its legacy. But hey, I'm just a fan." Audiences erupted with sympathy. Jay, meanwhile, projected calm professionalism. He insisted he was simply doing what NBC asked. But off-screen, insiders painted a different picture. Reports swirled that Jay had quietly pushed to reclaim his spot, lobbying executives behind the scenes. Whether true or not, the perception stuck. Jay had promised to step aside, then pulled the rug from under his successor. By mid-January, Conan refused NBC's new plan. In a dramatic open letter, he announced he would not continue hosting The Tonight Show at a later hour. Fans rallied behind him, launching the "I'm with Coco" movement online. Night after night, audiences tuned in, not just for laughs, but to witness history. The receipts from this feud are legendary. Clips of Conan's final shows went viral before viral was even the norm. His emotional farewell speech on January 22, 2010, where he thanked fans and urged them not to be cynical, cemented his place as a folk hero. "Nobody in life gets exactly what they thought they were going to get," he said. "But if you work really hard and you're kind, amazing things will happen." Jay, for his part, returned to The Tonight Show in March 2010. Ratings initially spiked, but his image took a permanent hit. Comedians from Jimmy Kimmel to Howard Stern openly mocked him. Bill Carter's book, The War for Late Night, documented the saga in painstaking detail, further fueling the narrative that Jay had muscled Conan out. Fans split sharply. Some defended Jay, pointing out that The Tonight Show was his legacy and NBC had bungled the transition. Others saw Conan as the wronged underdog, robbed of his dream job by an older host who couldn't let go. The internet age amplified the backlash. Memes, forums, and blogs all crowned Conan the people's champion. For Conan, the feud was both a setback and a launchpad. He left NBC with a hefty settlement, then rebounded with a nationwide comedy tour and a new show on TBS. Though he never matched the mainstream ratings of The Tonight Show, he built a loyal fan base who loved him precisely because he had stood up to the machine. In the long run, the feud gave him an aura of integrity. He was the guy who walked away rather than compromise. For Jay, the victory was Pyrrhic. He got his desk back, but at a cost. The nice guy image he had cultivated for decades now looked tarnished. Even though he stayed atop the ratings, his legacy was forever colored by the perception that he had betrayed Conan. In the court of public opinion, Jay won the war, but lost the narrative. By the time Jay retired for good in 2014, the wounds still hadn't fully healed. In interviews, he downplayed the drama, insisting he had simply followed NBC's orders. Conan, too, avoided personal attacks, though he never let go of the sting. When asked years later, he joked, "If I had $1 for every time someone asked me about Jay Leno, I'd be as rich as Jay Leno." So if Conan O'Brien was the protege who got burned, the next rival was no late-night comic at all. Instead, it was a fellow stand-up, one of the biggest of his generation, who accused Jay of crossing an unspoken line. This wasn't about a network. This was about loyalty in the comedy world itself. Are you ready for the next number? Howard Stern. If the Conan O'Brien saga was about network politics, Jay Leno's rivalry with Howard Stern was about something much more raw: respect, or more accurately, the lack of it. For decades, Howard Stern made a career out of skewering celebrities. But when it came to Jay, the jabs weren't just jokes. They were relentless. Stern accused Leno of betrayal, hypocrisy, and worse, of being a comedian who climbed to the top by stepping on the very people who helped him. Unlike Letterman or Conan, who battled Jay on TV, Howard used radio as his battlefield, and his war against Jay lasted decades. In the early days of their careers, Jay and Howard were cordial. Stern even admired Leno's stand-up chops, often praising his skill as one of the hardest-working comics on the circuit. But things changed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when both men became national figures. Jay rose through NBC's ranks as Carson's guest host, while Howard pushed the boundaries of radio with his irreverent, often shocking show. According to Stern, the turning point came when Leno allegedly borrowed ideas from him. Stern had pioneered outrageous call-in gags and edgy bits that blurred the line between comedy and chaos. Jay, Stern claimed, lifted those elements for The Tonight Show, watering them down for a mainstream audience without giving credit. Whether true or exaggerated, Stern took it personally. By the time Jay officially became Carson's successor in 1992, Howard had flipped from admiration to open hostility. He accused Jay of being a sellout, a phony, and his favorite insult, the thief of comedy. On screen, Jay never fired back. He maintained his trademark grin, kept his monologues clean, and avoided acknowledging Stern's attacks. But off-screen, Stern waged war. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, he ripped into Jay on air, often devoting entire segments to mocking his voice, his appearance, and his reputation as NBC's corporate golden boy. The conflict boiled over in the early 2000s when The Tonight Show began booking Stern's regular guests, people from his radio universe, like comic actors, sidekicks, and even minor personalities. Stern accused Jay of poaching his ecosystem, sanitizing it, and cashing in. His rants grew more personal. "Jay Leno is the biggest backstabber in the business," he declared on air. "He pretends to be everyone's friend, then steals their act." Meanwhile, Jay, true to form, played innocent. When pressed in interviews, he brushed Stern off with lines like, "Howard does what Howard does. He's funny. He's good at what he does." But his refusal to engage only made Stern angrier. The receipts for this feud are everywhere. Stern's tirades were broadcast daily to millions of listeners, immortalized on tape, and later replayed online. Clips from the 1990s show him tearing into Leno with venom rarely reserved for anyone else in entertainment. One particularly infamous moment came in 1995 when Stern appeared on The Tonight Show itself. Sitting across from Jay, Stern brought out two scantily clad women from his show and tried to push the interview into raunchy territory. Jay looked visibly uncomfortable, forced into an off-brand segment that clashed with his family-friendly style. Fans watching at home could see it. Stern had brought his war directly to Jay's turf. The fan reaction split sharply. Leno loyalists saw Stern as jealous and unnecessarily cruel. Stern's audience, however, ate it up, framing Jay as the sanitized fraud who couldn't handle real comedy. In the pre-social media age, these debates raged in magazines, tabloids, and call-in shows, fueling the rivalry year after year. Even as late as 2010, during the Conan debacle, Stern resurfaced the feud. He tore into Jay daily, calling him a snake and openly rooting for Conan to triumph. Fans noticed that Stern's voice amplified what many already believed, that Jay had survived not through loyalty, but through calculation. For Howard Stern, the feud with Jay was central to his brand of honesty. He positioned himself as the truth teller, the guy who called out hypocrisy in Hollywood, and Jay became his perfect foil. Every time Jay's career stumbled, Stern reminded his audience, "See? I told you he wasn't what he pretends to be." For Jay, the rivalry was harder to manage. Unlike Letterman or Conan, who were peers in late night, Stern operated outside NBC's ecosystem. He couldn't be ignored, but engaging him risked dragging The Tonight Show into a gutter it didn't want. So Jay's silence became his strategy. He let the numbers speak for themselves. While Stern dominated radio, Leno dominated TV. But the feud left scars. In comedy circles, Jay's reputation was always undercut by the whisper that Stern might have been right, that beneath the denim and the smile was a ruthless survivor. And in Stern's world, Jay was permanently branded as the guy who stole. So if Howard Stern was the rival who attacked Jay from the outside, the next feud came from within, another comic, one of Jay's own peers who accused him of breaking an unspoken code of loyalty. It wasn't about networks. It wasn't about shock radio. It was about a joke, a friendship, and the question of trust. And that feud? It was with one of the biggest comedians of all time. Get ready for the number 6, Bill Hicks. When fans think of Jay Leno's rivalries, they usually go straight to Letterman, Conan, or Howard Stern. But in comedy circles, one of the most infamous clashes wasn't with a late-night host at all. It was with a fellow stand-up, Bill Hicks, the dark, acerbic truth-teller who represented everything Leno was not. Their feud wasn't played out in TV ratings or corporate boardrooms. It was about loyalty, respect, and a single moment that many in the comedy world still talk about. For Hicks, it was betrayal. For Leno, it was business. And for fans, it remains one of the most painful divides in modern comedy history. In the early 1980s, Jay and Bill Hicks were two comics grinding away in the same clubs. Leno was already carving out a reputation as a hardworking, joke machine comic who played to the middle. Hicks, meanwhile, was pushing the envelope. Dark humor, social commentary, and blistering takedowns of politics, religion, and consumerism. They weren't close friends, but they respected each other. Both knew how brutal the stand-up circuit could be, and both were chasing the same dream of national recognition. But by the early 1990s, their paths diverged. Leno was established as Carson's heir at NBC, holding the most powerful job in comedy. Hicks was still the outsider, beloved by critics and hardcore fans, but too edgy for network executives. That's where the tension started. Hicks often mocked mainstream comics who played it safe, and Jay became his shorthand example. Hicks would sneer in his act, "Jay Leno, what happened to that guy? He used to be funny." The tipping point came in 1992, when Hicks performed a blistering routine on David Letterman's Late Show, skewering religion and the corporate mindset. The set was taped, but at the last minute, CBS pulled it, allegedly for being too controversial. Letterman himself later apologized to Hicks's mother, even airing the set posthumously in 2009. But among comics, the whispers started. Would Jay Leno have ever fought for Hicks if the roles were reversed? On screen, Jay and Hicks couldn't have been more different. Leno was the smiling host, telling headlines jokes about misprinted ads and doing car-themed segments that Middle America adored. Hicks was the firebrand, torching consumer culture and calling out the very networks Jay depended on. To viewers, they seemed to inhabit different planets. Off-screen, however, Hicks's disdain for Leno was sharp and personal. In interviews and stand-up rants, he accused Jay of abandoning his roots. The flashpoint came when Jay began appearing in commercials, most famously, Doritos ads in the early 1990s. Hicks tore into him during a routine, calling him a sellout. "Jay Leno doing Doritos commercials," Hicks growled in his set. "You're not a comic anymore. You're a spokesman." The line stuck. To this day, comedy fans quote it when debating Jay's career. Hicks felt comedy was sacred, a platform for truth. To him, Jay had crossed the line, cashing in at the expense of artistic integrity. The receipts for this feud live in the material itself. Hicks's Doritos rant became one of his most quoted bits, a scathing critique of Leno that spread through bootleg recordings and later the internet. Fans of Hicks saw it as proof that their hero was willing to die on the hill of integrity, even if it meant alienating one of the most powerful figures in comedy. Meanwhile, fans of Jay shrugged it off. They argued that television was a business, and Jay was simply navigating it successfully. After all, plenty of comics did commercials. But the cultural split was clear. To the counter-cultural audience who revered Hicks, Jay was the villain, the comedian who had traded edge for money. The tension deepened after Hicks's untimely death from cancer in 1994 at just 32. Many in the comedy community mythologized him as a martyr for truth. Jay, in contrast, was painted as the guy who had gone corporate. The juxtaposition between Hicks's early death and Jay's decades-long career only widened the chasm in fan perception. For Bill Hicks, the feud with Leno was more than personal. It became part of his legacy. He used Jay as a symbol of what he despised in entertainment: compromise, sellout culture, and the willingness to play it safe. The feud elevated Hicks in the eyes of his fans, proving he was willing to speak truth to power, even if it cost him friendships or opportunities. For Jay, the feud was a thorn in his side, but not one that derailed him. He rarely addressed Hicks publicly, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of calculation. But the silence only fueled the legend. Within the comedy world, Jay's name became shorthand for the compromises a comedian could make to survive. Hicks's rants lived on, passed around by young comics who saw him as a prophet. Ultimately, the rivalry wasn't about who won or lost. It was about two philosophies of comedy colliding, one that believed in truth at any cost, and one that believed in reaching the widest possible audience. Jay Leno built a career on survival. Bill Hicks built a legacy on defiance. And in the end, their feud represented the eternal divide in comedy itself. If Bill Hicks was the fellow comic who called Jay out as a sellout, the next and final rival was the one who cut deepest, because it wasn't just about jokes or ratings or commercials. It was about legacy. And this rival wasn't just another comedian. He was the man Jay Leno will always be measured against, whether he likes it or not. Get ready for last one: Johnny Carson's legacy. You could name Kimmel, Letterman, Conan, even Howard Stern or Bill Hicks. But when you strip it all away, Jay Leno's greatest rival wasn't a person he traded barbs with. It was the ghost of Johnny Carson's legacy, the looming shadow that hung over him every single night he sat behind the Tonight Show desk. Because no matter how many ratings battles Jay won, no matter how many monologues he told, he was always compared to Johnny, and in that comparison, he rarely came out on top. The rivalry began the day Jay was announced as Carson's successor in 1992. Carson had built The Tonight Show into a cultural cathedral over 30 years, and his dry wit, impeccable timing, and quiet authority made him untouchable. To inherit that throne was both a blessing and a curse. Jay got the job, but almost immediately the comparison started. Carson was urbane, Jay was middle American. Carson was subtle, Jay was broad. Carson was the standard of class, Jay was the guy in denim, making easy headlines jokes. For millions of fans who had grown up with Johnny, Jay seemed like the downgrade, and that stigma never fully left. Even Carson himself reinforced it. As mentioned earlier, he reportedly favored David Letterman, and after his retirement, he never once appeared on Jay's Tonight Show. Instead, his few public nods went to Letterman, sending an unspoken message that Jay wasn't the true heir. For Jay, this wasn't just a rivalry, it was an unrelenting uphill battle against a man who wasn't even in the chair anymore. On screen, Jay played the affable host. He tried to carry Carson's torch without imitating him, leaning into his own style of quick-hit monologues and broad humor. He booked the biggest celebrities, from movie stars to politicians, and turned headlines into a staple. The show won ratings, proving that America, at least, was on his side. But off-screen, the Carson shadow loomed. Industry insiders often whispered that Jay was merely a placeholder, that Letterman was the real heir, even if NBC had chosen differently. Every time Jay was criticized for being safe, boring, or corporate, the implied comparison was to Johnny's effortless cool. In Hollywood circles, the divide was stark. Critics rarely praised Jay the way they had Carson. When Carson died in 2005, the tributes that poured out made it clear Johnny was the gold standard. Jay was the survivor. The receipts of this rivalry live in the press clippings of an entire era. Articles in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and Rolling Stone routinely drew the contrast. Fans noticed the absence of Carson from Jay's show and the presence of Carson jokes on Letterman's. When Johnny passed, Letterman honored him by reading unused Carson pen jokes, a symbolic torch passing that seemed to bypass Leno entirely. For years, fan communities debated the question, was Jay really the heir to Carson, or just the guy who lucked into the spot? Team Leno fans pointed to ratings dominance. Jay consistently outdrew Letterman for much of his run. But Team Carson purists insisted ratings weren't the measure. Cultural impact was. And by that yardstick, Jay fell short. The Conan debacle only deepened the divide. Many fans framed it as further proof that Jay wasn't Carson's kind of host. Carson had retired with dignity. Jay, in contrast, had clung to power. Whether fair or not, the perception stuck. For Jay Leno, the shadow of Johnny Carson became both motivator and tormentor. He knew he'd never out Carson. Instead, he doubled down on being Jay, accessible, relentless, tireless. He worked harder than anyone, never missing a show, never letting up on his grind. That work ethic carried him through 22 years behind the desk, a feat few could match. But the rivalry also defined his legacy in bittersweet ways. When people look back on Jay's career, they don't just see the victories. They see the comparisons. They see the cold shoulder from Johnny. They see the Letterman split. They see the Conan debacle. All of it circles back to one central truth. Jay's entire career was spent under Carson's shadow, fighting to prove himself worthy of a chair that many believed wasn't his to claim. And in the end, that was the rivalry he could never win. Because Johnny Carson wasn't just another host. He was the myth, the legend, the ghost that Jay Leno spent his entire career chasing and never quite caught. So after 7 rivals, Kimmel, Carson, Letterman, Conan, Stern, Hicks, and the ghost of Carson's legacy, where does that leave Jay Leno? That's where the story closes. But it's not the end, because the legacy of these rivalries still shapes how we talk about him today. When you add up the 7 rivalries, a pattern emerges. Jay Leno's life in late night wasn't just about comedy, it was about survival. Against Johnny Carson's cold shoulder, against David Letterman's biting sarcasm, against Conan O'Brien's fan-fueled rebellion, against Howard Stern's relentless radio attacks, and against Bill Hicks's moral critiques, Jay stood firm. He wasn't always loved. He wasn't always respected. But he survived longer than almost anyone else. That survival came at a cost. To this day, critics often rank him below his rivals in cultural impact. He didn't redefine comedy like Letterman. He didn't become a countercultural prophet like Hicks. He didn't inspire loyalty like Conan. But Jay did what few could. He outlasted them. His 22 years at the helm of The Tonight Show made him a fixture of American television, even if it meant being the corporate guy rather than the rebel. Today, Jay Leno is mostly retired from the spotlight, occasionally appearing in comedy clubs and focusing on his love of cars with shows like Jay Leno's Garage. The late-night wars are long over. Letterman retired. Conan moved to cable and then streaming. Kimmel found his lane. Stern reinvented himself on satellite. Hicks remains immortal in legend. But Jay, true to form, just keeps on smiling, wrench in hand, still working. And maybe that's the lesson. Jay Leno never needed to be the myth, the rebel, or the visionary. He just needed to keep showing up. And for decades, that's exactly what he did. So what do you think? Was Jay Leno the ultimate survivor of late night or the ultimate opportunist who burned bridges along the way? Did he win the game, or was he forever haunted by rivals who defined him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to hit like, share this video with your fellow comedy fans, and subscribe for more deep dives into the feuds and friendships that shape television history. And if you're ready for another wild ride, Check out our next video, you won't want to miss it.